I'm David Wilcock, and this is Wisdom Teachings. Is there a hidden secret to life that involves the use of energy much more than we ever thought? Does life begin as a template in the quantum field before it ever precipitates into biological forms? Is there a way in which a single photon of light can have the code for an entire species of life form on Earth, and can that code be transferred from one organism into another and thus cause direct, absolute genetic evolution in a spontaneous fashion? Might we see this in the case of laser light between frog eggs and salamander eggs, and with microwave frequencies in the case of chicken eggs being transformed into a duck-chicken hybrid? These are the exciting questions we're going to answer in this week's episode. All of the work that we've been doing on this show is leading up to some very arresting conclusions. Let's not forget about what we learned with interplanetary climate change, that we are seeing a totally dramatic transformation of all of the planets in our solar system and the sun, so huge that it frankly baffles me that NASA is not telling us what the heck is going on. No matter how you look at this, we can see there is a dramatic increase in the overall energy in our solar system, and we know that we're actually moving into a higher energetic region in our galaxy where there is a higher temperature, a much higher magnetic field, and this does apparently have an effect on our evolutionary process. These ancient prophecies, these ancient religious teachings about ascension, about species transformation, are not really ancient at all. They're actually from the future. They're from people far more evolved than we are, who can go to any point in our timeline that they want to and give us information, which is actually far more advanced than we give it credit for. So all of this time we say, oh, it's an ancient prophecy, yeah, it's a myth, it's a legend, it's whatever. No, look, when you see 35 different spiritual traditions on Earth, all telling us the sun is going to do a big flash, and it's going to transform what it means to be human in some way. And then you have the physical proof of interplanetary climate change showing us this happening. That is a very, very compelling case. It's a case that cannot be denied. And so we've been building up to this foundation. We went through all of this stuff with the planets changing in the solar system, and now I've taken you through biology, and I'm revealing how the actual makeup of DNA is a harmonic frequency. If you take the double helix of the DNA molecule, you can wrap it around this geometric pattern called a dodecahedron, and what I'm saying is that the dodec is a vibration. The geometry is a representation of a vibrational frequency. So that means the DNA molecule doesn't start as matter. It starts as something apart from matter. It starts as something that is a wave on a very intrinsic level. And that brings us to the exciting work that we've been talking about in previous episodes of Dr. Peter Garyaev. And Dr. Garyaev began his work, as we were saying, with the DNA phantom effect, a very, very bizarre finding in which he took DNA and he put it into a small room, and the DNA absorbs all the light in the room into itself. So it would be the equivalent of if I'm standing here and there's light that normally is all around me in the room, and then suddenly some gravitational force pulls all that light into me so that the rest of the room is completely dark now and I'm the only thing that has any visibility. That's how bizarre it is. It's literally like the DNA is a miniature black hole absorbing light, and the really strange part is that when you take the DNA out of the room, a phantom still holds those photons in the double helix pattern. There's no DNA there anymore, but the light is still held in place, and it actually lasts for an astonishing 30 days. Some force is grabbing that light, cramming it into that shape, and keeping it there for 30 whole days. So what does this tell us? This tells us that DNA originates as some sort of underlying quantum blueprint pattern, and we know that pattern is this dodecahedral shape that you can get when you wrap the double helix around that little guy, that little dodecahedron. So what's happening from here is that we also looked at the genetic code, and we saw how the 4 nucleotides are the 4 corners of a tetrahedron, and you move that around inside a dodecahedron, and now the 20 points on the edge of the dodecahedron are your 20 basic amino acids. It sounds crazy, but it answers all of these riddles in genetics where they don't know why certain amino acids will talk to each other and others will not. That's all vibrational. The dodec, the tetrahedron, these forms like nucleotides, amino acids, they are simply the quantum precipitation into matter of something that starts as information. And that's Gareyayev's big model of what he calls supergenes, where he says there is an informational component to life that is the precursor to its physical manifestation. So that gets really strange because we're now looking at life not as a product of matter, but as a product of space and time and energy itself. Life is built into the universe's design from the get-go. And what we've been looking at here really takes us to the next level because Gareyayev's work includes this idea that spontaneous informational change can be introduced to DNA. Let's not forget what we saw in previous episodes regarding the elderly woman who had no teeth left in her mouth, and then he zapped her granddaughter's blood, and by hitting it with the laser, he was able to release photons from that granddaughter's blood that had information to tell the old lady's body how to regrow teeth. And as you see again in this illustration, 4 molars that had not existed in her mouth before grew again. Actually, no, there's 3 molars and there's 1 tooth in the front, as you see there. So this is really amazing. Now, what that tells us is that our DNA degrades over time, which we know, that's what actually is causing aging. But there may be a way to reverse that process. There may be a way to dramatically enhance our lifespan. And remember, the late William Tompkins was telling us that in the future we will have these pills we can take that will extend our lifespan to 2,000 years or more. And that is the result of this same type of vibrational science. The idea that the DNA, we're thinking of it as a hard physical thing. We're not thinking of it as a template of information. We're not thinking of it as a wave. And that you can get the pure wave, a nice compressed distilled version of that in photons, beam them into your body and transform your health. And this was revealed to us in a very compelling way by the rat pancreas study that we saw in the last episode from Gareyev, in which he took a healthy pancreas from a healthy donor rat and then shined a laser beam through it and beamed that light into a rat whose pancreas was gone because it had been destroyed by a toxin he injected in that rat called Alloxan. And that causes diabetes. You have no pancreas, you can't make insulin, your blood sugar skyrockets, and you die. So right at the point where the rats were about to die, after 4 days, where their blood sugar is up to around 34, as you can see in this graph right here, only then, at the point of total mortality, where they're right on the brink of death, did he then start beaming this wave into them, and instead of dying, their blood sugar stays the same for another 5 days, but then, as you can see there around day 10 of the experiment, 6 days after he begins beaming it in, their blood sugar dramatically plummets, and by day 12, they're all essentially back to normal health, and if you were to check them, you find out that they have regrown their pancreas. This is absolutely stunning, because what it tells us is that we don't need to have organ transplants. You can regrow the organ in your own body by simply telling it what it needs information-wise. You introduce the information that is required to help the body heal itself. And this all gets back to that DNA phantom. This all gets back to the idea that the DNA molecule itself is actually not physical. It starts as a wave pattern, and that wave pattern has information in it. And that information can be stored in photons. So photons become a very cool type of nanotechnology, and since that is the tiniest and most basic aspect of any existence in the universe, it truly is the case that light is intelligent, light is alive, and light is the building block of everything, both matter and biological life. Everything we need to make biological life can be stored in one photon, in a curious fractal way. So what does that actually mean for this concept of ascension, this concept of species transformation? Well, this gets into the next area of Gary Iyev's research, which I have discussed before. It's absolutely worth repeating now. And that is what happened when he took this science that he calls supergenes, this science of shining a laser beam through, let's say, the healthy rat pancreas, and then you regrow another pancreas in a rat where it's been destroyed. What happens if you don't keep to the same species? What happens if you zap a laser through one species and redirect it into another? Now, generally speaking, you're not going to get an adult species of a particular type of being to actually transform into something else. This is an important point. You have to catch this while it's in the gestation phase, while there are just a few cells that are dividing and reproducing, and at that point, you might only have, let's say, 25 cells that are making that entire being. So if you could zap that small number of cells with a different genetic code, then Gary Iyev's research has concluded that you can actually restructure that DNA completely. DNA is a very curious thing where the differences between even the mustard weed and a human being in terms of its genes are very small. We really don't have that much that separates us from all the other species on Earth. The DNA is remarkably similar, and that means that every single type of life that we see on Earth is really just a slight shift away DNA-wise from everything else. It only requires minor modifications. Now, if we strictly think of DNA as a hard crystal molecule that can't move around, then there would be no reason to think that DNA could ever change or evolve. The best that we've ever done in terms of conventional science to understand human evolution is this idea that DNA must take a random mutation. There has to be something that happens that's unexpected, some problem with the code that then causes a alteration in the way it looks, and most of these are going to be non-beneficial. It's going to lead to mutated life that doesn't work out very well and it dies, and that once in a while something will happen that's actually beneficial. Well, to me, that whole process stinks of a lack of intelligent design, a lack of any type of greater purpose to the universe. It's a materialistic view. It's a view that says that we are an accident, that it's a bunch of random chances and happenstances that led to us being the way we are. But there's all different aspects in the biological field that we see that do not suggest it's random. We have, for example, things like the eye that require irreducible complexity, it's called, in terms of how they're built. The camera lens and the eye, which is the same throughout almost all species on Earth, are almost exactly the same, where you have an iris that opens and closes, you have a focal length, you have a lens, it has to go onto a retina, which has a certain number of cells that will pick up light and sense it. The idea that something that complex could happen by itself, randomly, is ridiculous. And this gets back again to the question of the chicken or the egg, which came first. And the answer is neither one. You're constraining the argument to a false assumption, which is that one has to originate before the other, and there could be nothing before that. This idea of information, this idea of a field that makes chickens, will make the chicken and the egg. That's what came first. So you don't want to get constrained into a yes or no answer there. What we're actually seeing now is that life is fundamentally beginning energetically. And so the DNA molecule doesn't really have to shift that much from one form to another to be able to make various types of species. That means that with this new science we're looking at, the science of these photons, a photon can be beamed into one type of DNA and it can actually transform it into something else. And we saw that with our Nobel laureate, Dr. Luc Montagnier, where he was actually able to get DNA fragments and even entire bacteria and viruses to grow inside cell cultures that did not have that in there before. You can take the existing DNA material in a cell and actually rewrite it with nothing more than energy. Little molecules are literally jumping around and moving from place to place. They're rebuilding themselves in a new form. And this is that microgravitational force where there's a specific frequency, there's a specific geometric arrangement of that energy that's grabbing things and saying, you go over there, and actually moving it. So what was so amazing to me was Garyaev's salamander frog experiment. I first heard about this, I believe, back in 2000, and it came from a curious article by Fossar and Bludorf, those two German scientists who went out there in a big way, and their work got spread all over the internet. And I had been looking for something like this for a long time. I'd already been researching this stuff since probably 1993 really heavily. And I was waiting to see some kind of proof that life could spontaneously evolve. So the Fossar-Bludorf article went very viral on the internet. You still see it everywhere. It often says, it starts with the sentence, the human DNA is a biological internet, and in many ways it behaves just like one. And you type that keyword in, and it is all over the place on the search engines. So this absolutely rocked my world. I already had heard about Garyaev doing other things with the DNA phantom effect, but this was stunning. So it's actually a very simple experiment in its core, because what we're seeing here is that you begin with eggs that were laid by a frog. And of course, inside those eggs is a little zygote, a little tiny blastula of cells, let's say, that hasn't really grown that many cells. So you could actually hit all of these cells simultaneously with a laser beam, and if that laser has the code of a different type of life, it will transform that DNA. That's the idea. So then what Garyaev did is he actually shined the laser through eggs that had been laid by a salamander. And so now you have to scratch your head for a second and say, okay, what happens if you have a hermetically sealed container with salamander eggs and another hermetically sealed container with frog eggs, and you zap a laser through the salamander eggs into the frog eggs? And that's all you do. In conventional biological science, nothing is supposed to happen. But in Garyaev's research, it is totally jaw-dropping, because those eggs that had been laid by a frog got a total DNA rewrite. And they turned into normal salamanders. And then the next question would be, okay, wait a minute. Is this like cloning? No, it's not. Because Dolly the sheep, the first cloned animal that we've heard about, had all kinds of genetic problems. There were mutations, there were abnormalities, and there was an early mortality. In the case of something like this,